Good day. My name is Zasha Desaskrivovnetsky-Gruber, and I am the Policy Director and Gender Specialist at the BC Council for International Cooperation. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that our work takes place in the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Tsawwassen nations. And we make this acknowledgement to pay profound respect to the hosts of this land, for their stewardship for time immemorial, and to remind ourselves of both their history and their present-day contributions to our society as a whole. As educators, we are aware of the importance of place in learning because global citizenship grows from that sense of rootedness in specific contexts, issues, and worldviews. The theme of the session is very close to my heart. As a former professor in development studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, I was inspired by the students I came across, most of whom were first-generation graduates. Despite the intersecting barriers that racialized and immigrant youth face in South Africa, my students showed incredible tenacity, resilience, and determination to advocate for change, power, their rights, and fundamental freedoms for themselves, their families, and their communities. And I was honored to be a part of their journeys and to have created opportunities for them associated with service learning, experiential learning, and place-based education, all grounded in their local culture, phenomenon, and issues that were important to them. So to some extent, one could argue that we, as the lecturers, the supervisors, the academic mentors, created an enabling environment for them at this university for these students. But in all honesty, they were the ones driving transformational at the change at the University of Johannesburg in their communities and in their local universities. In fact, they're the ones who made us think critically and reflectively on what development, international development is and should be. Now, in the Canadian context, which is what we'll be focusing on today, educators, administrators, and students are taking note of the urgent need for educational institutions to lead transformational change. And many are noting the centrality of the SDGs to these change processes. In fact, if you looked at the side event schedule today, several of the events have specifically focused on this topic. In this session, we'll be hearing from sustainability leaders in the education sector about what they're doing and how they're successful and what type of additional work is needed in this regard. And they'll reflect on some of the processes and challenges that they've faced in driving transformational change around the SDGs in their universities and academic settings. I'd now like to welcome you to our incredible panel. You can review their full biographies on the website, but for now, I'm just going to highlight one or two aspects of their experience, just to contextualize the discussion. So Rosalind Warner is a research fellow with the Earth Systems Governance Research Project. She's also a board member of the Canadian Environmental Network, as well as a board member of the BC Council for International Cooperation. And she leads various different environmental groups, such as the Okanagan Sustainability Leadership Council, the Okanagan Climate Hub, and Citizens Climate Lobby Okanagan Chapter. Thanks, Rose. Then we've got Luis Patricio, and he's representing the Pillar Non-Profit Network. And he's been involved in extensive localization projects, looking at the way in which the global goals can be localized in different communities. He's one of the co-leads of the SDG Cities program, as well as a part-time teacher at Huron University, and where he actually engages and uses the SDGs as the framework around which he teaches. Shamta Hunter is a seasonal instructor in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. She's also the manager of the sustainability engagement with the UBC Sustainability Hub at the University of British Columbia. And in fact, the UBC Sustainability Hub has put on an incredible show this week with a series of very, very exciting and interesting events that were hosted around the SDGs. And she's also the co-chair of various different publications related to development studies and curriculum studies. And Jali Mishra, she's an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia. She's also an author and a policy analyst, and she's worked extensively with BCCIC as a board member. And excitingly, she's also the co-founder of Reimagine 17, a youth-led not-for-profit organization which works to amplify youth action and reimagine progress towards sustainable development. So I'm going to start off the panel by asking Shamta the first question. Why are the SDGs relevant to educational institutions today?
Oh, sorry, I have to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Zada, for that amazing introduction, and welcome everyone to this session. Thanks for joining us. SDGs, I believe they offer, of course, a pathway forward for us as a global society. In some sense, I believe they're goals for humanity. We have identified them as areas of concerns to work toward resolving them as a global community. And being part of the global society, universities play an important role in cultivating these competencies for global citizenship in our youth and young adults. So in some sense, SDGs become important in universities' goals of developing the competencies to tackle the challenges of today and the future. At UBC, one of the ways we are doing this is through the Sustainability Ambassadors Program, which is based in the Sustainability Competencies Framework that offer a platform to students to not only enhance and cultivate the competencies and capacities to work on these challenges, but to transform their ideas of climate sustainability and well-being into action.
Thank you, Shabta. Louise, you're part of the community of practice that looks at the engagement of educators with the SDGs, and you're also teaching with the SDGs as a framework. Why are the SDGs so relevant to the work that you're doing?
Thanks for the kind words. And yeah, like starting from the big picture, really universities, they have two main basic roles. That is enabler of change and also as a target of change. So as an enabler, it's really through teaching and learning, through research, through community engagement. And as a target, it's really looking at the procurement practices, internal policies, the physical building spaces that university holds, and the governance model. As a teacher, the program that I teach is the governance, leadership, and ethics, and the course is environmental stewardship. So it's becoming more and more evident that those three pillars are deeply interconnected: the economic, the environmental, and the social issues. And we understand this in an abstract level. So I just want to share a couple of practical examples on how we actually do this in real life situations in the classroom. So for example, if you're looking at a climate emergency action plan and we have measures that relate to electric vehicles or active transportation and bikes, we can look at how much greenhouse gas emissions we can reduce with those initiatives. But it's also important how those different measures that we can take will reduce, energy consumption, resource use, stormwater, flooding for having too many paved roads, and even the other things like physical health, mental health, belonging. So I try to bring to class the SDG framework so students can understand that interconnection in a very practical way, aligning with real life examples. And this is my entry point, right? Like the environment and also leadership. I believe that every program in every university really can connect to the SDGs, either it's law, engineering, business school, medical school. So the SDGs are extremely relevant. And this is just one example related to teaching and learning. So all those other areas would have a great impact into universities.
So Louise, just to clarify, you're suggesting that the SDGs provide a good entry point towards a more interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary teaching philosophy or framework.
Yes, absolutely. So if you think about an ethical university that provides the conditions for us to learn more critically, to really create a real positive impact in our society, whatever the program we're working with, whatever topic we're teaching, we can be siloed, and obviously, and that's what I mean by the entry point. We have our focus of studies, but we really need to consider the impacts that our program will have in society as a whole. And I think the SDGs really provide a great framework to see those connections and really think critically on how we can really shift and create this positive impact.
Thanks, Louise. Anjali, you're a student and a youth organizer. Why are the SDGs relevant to you and the work that you're doing with your peers?
So as a young person whose work primarily occurs in an educational institution, or at least in that context, it's a myth that education can be separated from the environmental, social, and economic context in which it operates. Educational institutions and the people within them actively shape, either positively or negatively, the issues that the SDGs address. And young people like me in educational institutions are recognizing this, have been organizing to positively shape the impact we have. And it's why some of us came together to share experiences, failures, and successes through what eventually became Reimagine 17, because we believe that there's power in these institutions to meaningfully contribute to sustainability.
Thank you, Anjali. So many universities that we have been engaging with are actually embarking on localization processes. So what does this mean in an academic setting? Louise?
Yeah, that's a good question, Zosha. The SDGs are really this global goals. So the principles, you can say they're more universal, but many of their metrics really are applicable to countries or even like global challenges in the international stage. So localization is basically to translate those metrics into meaningful indicators in a university setting and keep it in line with those big visions and principles, things like leaving no one behind, or the targets and the indicators as a network, indivisible. And those will vary depending where you are in the world. So localization is the main focus of my work. So far, we did a localization, as you mentioned in the introduction, here in London, Ontario. And the program that I'm running right now, the SDG Cities program, it's helping organizations localize the SDGs. So a general understanding is that the majority of the SDG agenda actually requires an active participation at a local level. And many decisions are made at the local level and even implemented at this local level. And we can talk about later all the different examples. So it's the same thing for universities, is beside the alignment of the vision and the translation of these metrics. Localization means to work with your networks, your community, your local assets, and addressing the challenges that your community is facing. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And in that sense, universities really have a high degree of agency, of autonomy to decide which path they need to take.
Thank you, Louise. Shanta, as I'm not sure if our audience knows, but UBC, the University of British Columbia, is like a city. I mean, it's a monster, a beast. How has UBC engaged with localization processes?
So my work, particularly within this context, is my focus is curriculum and pedagogy within the climate and sustainability teaching and learning. And for us and for our University Sustainability Hub, the implementation at the curriculum and pedagogy level really looks like community engaged learning and experiential learning, learning through practice, through project-based learning, through working with community partners on real issues and projects. And that's what we are really trying to enhance in the student experience at UBC. It also means place-based learning, that is understanding the importance of place, its cultures, its traditions, local ecosystems, and traditional ecological knowledge of local and indigenous people. So we are really trying to build and enhance that as much as we can. And I believe universities are starting to see the importance and relevance of community engaged learning and place-based learning to the local and global issues. And we are trying to engage our students through these meaningful engagement opportunities as much as possible through our community partners.
So can you just give us a little example of what community engaged learning will look like in real terms?
Yeah, so we have a whole unit called the Center for Community Engaged Learning at UBC, and they work closely with faculty members at the courses level to engage projects within the community and bring them into the classroom, and really connect the curriculum of the courses with these community projects. And students work with the faculty member, of course, but also with the community partners on their relevant projects that they are wanting to work on within the community. So that's one really good example that we are really trying to enhance that partnership through our community partners, but also try and bring reality of what it's like to work on sustainability and climate issues within the community into the classroom context.
So from an academic pedagogy point of view, it's very much grounded in this idea of authentic learning, linking up learning experiences with what's actually happening out in society and the problems and challenges that society is facing. So I mean, from the sounds of it, you're creating these opportunities for learning. But I just want to take it one step further, linking it to the transformative agenda of the transformative focus of the 2030 agenda. Raz, in your opinion, what responsibility do academic institutions have to support the transformation of students into global citizens or active citizens in relation to international development and international cooperation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha, and very nice to be here and talk about this really exciting issue. I think there's two things I'd focus on. The first is I teach in a small community college in the interior of British Columbia, and my students don't have a lot of international experience. They don't necessarily follow the news or what's going on in the rest of the world. There's two things that I try to convey through the SDGs. One is I teach political science, and I really feel like if we want to talk about transformation, we're going to have to talk about government. We're going to have to talk about policies and decision making and power and how those things are done, how those decisions are made. The thing about the SDGs is that you can convey to students, look, this is something that governments have promised. This is a way that we can hold them to account. This is what they've said they're going to do. Are they doing it? Are they stepping up? And so the SDGs can be like a lever. When governments and decision makers and those in power are saying, this is what we intend to do, then it's important for young people to know that this is something they can hold them to account. They can hold their feet to the fire. And transformation won't come about necessarily in a big, a big event. It might come about through just talking about water, talking about food, talking about poverty, talking about education and gender, and saying to governments, wait a minute, you said you were going to do this, why not do it? The second thing that I would mention too is that there's a way for the SDGs to kind of open up the students' horizons, right? So I think you have to start from where they are. So where are they coming to you from? But you can also help students see that there's shared problems around the world, that even though we're not all on the same footing, we all share similar problems and similar challenges. And we don't all experience the world in the same way. We're not on equal ground. But what we do share is we have common needs. We all want clean air. We want meaningful work. We want opportunities to fulfill our lives to the best that we can, to have the opportunities to reach our full capacity. And so when I talk about international development, that is the way that I speak about it with my students and say, these are things that we all share.
Thank you, Roz. And Charlie, I must say, considering all the work and your engagement with BCCIC, you are an active global citizen. You are engaged with global problems and challenges. You're using your voice to advocate for the rights and well-being of others. To what extent would you say that the university or the universities you've attended or schools you've attended serve to transform you into that global citizen?
Thanks for asking the question. What I'd say is it's not so much the school that transforms students, or at least myself, into global citizens. It's that students have what they need to be global citizens themselves. If I think of my own lived experiences as the daughter of Indian immigrants growing up in what is currently Canada, my simple existence in this context was the most rich experience that transformed me into what we would call a global citizen. And what I'd say is that if anything, young people, students are leading and driving this work, and there's no need to think about transforming us. That said, I don't think it's sufficient for academic institutions to then just say that we have these student leaders and place the burden of global citizenship on us. I believe that the duty of academic institutions is to serve us, provide the infrastructure to support our leadership, including resources, funding, mentorship. And this is what is needed to allow us to lead in the way that amplifies rather than tries to control our leadership.
Thank you, Anjali. And that goes to that point earlier about the importance of universities creating that enabling environment for students then to assume leadership roles. Shamta, is that how, when you look at the ambassador program, for instance, that you're implementing, how much leadership are youth and students exercising in this? Or is your role transformative?
Maybe that Anjali should be the one answering that question because she was part of that program. But I would say that in terms of transformation and responsibilities of academic institutions, I would kind of step away a little bit and think about, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that we are all part of this global community and we all have the responsibility toward these goals. Issues in one part of the world will impact the others sooner or later. So we have to know that. We have to know that we are all interconnected. I do think that we have to kind of move beyond our boundaries and recognize that we are all connected in some way, humans, non-humans, living and non-living. So kind of in the context of academic institutions, I believe they have the responsibility to cultivate the sense of consciousness and responsibility and agency by fostering understanding of relationships across cultures, which may lead to that transformation in some ways, I would say. I also think that we need to reconstruct or reorient our worldviews to understand the anthropocentric influences. What does that mean? Develop our capacity to face the challenges, uncertainties at all levels, social, economic, and ecological, and nurture the problem solvers and action takers, I would say. And I think that's where the universities can come in and offer that platform and build those capacities in students to take that role as a global citizen.
Shanta, I really liked some of the phrases you used there about like cultivating consciousness or reorientating mindsets. Now, BCCIC works with over 100 organizations, and many of them struggle with the SDGs in the sense that they find the SDGs and the framework of the SDGs very, very colonial. And that if you're going to be cultivating a consciousness around the SDGs, you're actually just perpetuating colonial grounded hierarchies and inequalities and so forth. So I guess just stepping back slightly, like to what extent are the universities there just to promote the SDGs and promote the 2030 Agenda Framework? Or are you and your colleagues, Louise, Roz, also encouraging critical reflection about the SDGs and around the roots and perhaps inequalities associated with the SDG framework? Shanta?
Yeah, I mean that's a big point, and I think the SDG framework is not perfect by any means. And one of the key, I mean, there are many weaknesses. One is that it is very broad, and sometimes it doesn't speak to people. It's just too much to take in. It's vague. A lot of the goals are very vague in terms of people who are really wanting to measure their progress. Like you said, it's based in the colonial construct, and it's missing some of those indigenous perspectives. It's important to recognize that. It's important, and that's why I talk about how do we bring in the values that we believe in, and kind of grounding in the place-based learning, and through constructing those relationships and cultivating those relationships with our indigenous nations that we are part of. So I think it is important to recognize that and then move forward towards achieving it as a collaborative community, rather than saying that, you know, it doesn't work and you know, it's somehow it's not going to work. In my experience, what has worked is that when I talk about the SDG as a framework, as a whole framework, it doesn't speak to people because of all of these areas of concern. What does speak is at the goals level, and trying to leverage and connect what people are already doing, some of the goals that they already have, and trying to connect them with at the goals level rather than at the framework level. And that really works because we know that if you work on one goal, it will influence the others. It's all interconnected. It is like a puzzle. So in my work, that's what I found, that it's moving beyond that, making sure that you are including the concerns that have been brought up, and moving as a big community, making sure that Indigenous concerns are part of the conversation.
Thank you, Shanta. Louise, do you encourage critical reflection when you're teaching with the SDG framework?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I'll go back to my main area of expertise with the SDGs. Localization it's absolutely crucial. And just like universities, like the SDGs are also a reflection of our society. And we would be naive to think that they are perfect. So it's easier to agree. Again, it's easier to agree on the big vision and the main principles. But what that means in practice, how to actually implement the SDGs, it requires critical, ongoing participatory process. So we really need to hear from the students. And I'm originally from Brazil, so I grew up reading and watching Paulo Freire. And one of my favorite quotes from him is that no one teaches anyone, and no one learns alone. We learn together, mediated by the world. So in that sense, any kind of education that doesn't take into consideration the social context, the situation, the place where we're having the learning, it's a form of oppression. So absolutely to be critical when you're learning about anything, and especially SDGs, which are so important and they have a potential to be transformative. We need to be very critical about what we're learning, because it can really frame the discourse in many different directions.
Thank you, Louise. Going back to this point about transformative change and the role of universities, to what extent do universities have a role to play in engaging with the Leave No One Behind pledge beyond the physical space of the university, or engaging with some of the injustices experienced by racialized and immigrant students on campus, for instance? Or is it just about imparting knowledge and creating opportunities for learning? Roz?
Oh, I really want to echo what my fellow panelists are saying here. I'm just sitting here nodding, thinking this is exactly it. And as was said earlier, universities are not separate from or different from the rest of society. They reflect those power relations. They reflect those trends, those priorities that we see out in the quote unquote real world. And so, but at the same time, the university can be a microcosm. It can be a place where you can, it could be a place where you can explore in a relatively, education-oriented, learning-oriented space in a way that can allow people to actually realize their full individual selves, right? Their potential. And I want to share the example of the Sustainable Development Challenge, which comes to mind when Anjali was talking about is being student-led and co-led and part of a community, because in that program that we hold here in the Okanagan, we asked students, we start with the students. A lot of it has to do with where you're starting and where you're ending, right? We're not ending with the SDGs. We're starting with the students. The students define a project and they say, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I care about, whether it's a podcast, whether it's something to help homeless people, whether it's something around recycling or composting or any number of different issues. And then they run with it. They run with that project and they design it, they make it, it's according to standards. So they're learning all kinds of skills and capabilities as they go along. And then they present it to the community, and then the community can weigh in on the types of things they're doing. And so it makes it real for them. It makes it matter, right? And at the same time, they're also expanding into how does this relate to other issues? So if I'm working on composting, how does that relate to life on land? How does that relate to gender? How does that relate to climate change? And so they're starting to see how these things play themselves out in the way in which they're related to each other. I do feel that universities, have an absolutely important role. They can encourage this kind of creative and analytical thinking and critical thinking on the part of our future global citizens. But it doesn't happen in the abstract. I think it really happens with that concrete decision making that each person makes about how and what it is about the SDGs that they're going to run with.
Thank you, Roz. And Charlie, do you think that universities have a role or can have an impact on communities beyond the physical space of the university? And have you been involved in any practical projects where you've engaged with the SDGs more broadly?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like this is a bit of a loaded question in that in my head, when you ask it, it's just automatically yes. We cannot separate the impact of universities, as we've said multiple times today, from the injustices that exist. And you are going to have an impact as an educational institution, as an educator, as a student. So it is really up to you to decide how intentional, how reflective you are going to be about the impact you inevitably have. What I've been doing with other young people, some work that ties to the SDGs, some work that perhaps does not, is as students, recognizing the positionality we have, the power we may have in our institutions, across our institutions to drive change. And like, to get super specific here, something we realized as students at our educational institutions is that, funny enough, because of our positionality, we may be able to have a more radical, powerful voice than some of the staff and faculty who do not feel that they can push the university in the same way we can. Across universities, mobilizing, coming together as like a block that cares about sustainability is a powerful way to try to shift policy through advocacy. So in so many concrete ways, us as students with our positionality are impacting the broader context with outside of us, beyond us.
And Charlie is such a powerful speaker, and I love that you use your hands when you engage with like such passion and enthusiasm. Shamta, have you found that students at UBC, for instance, are in a better position to advocate for change? Like, what type of challenges have you faced as an academic in terms of promoting this transformational agenda at the university, and how have you tried to overcome it?
Work with the students, make students your partners. I think that's co-creating with the students. I think that's what I've been doing, and I think Anjali would I don't know, hopefully agree with me that, you know, just making, and I agree what Anjali has said, and we have had conversations on that as well, that students sometimes have more of a power than faculty and staff because of various systemic, you know, invisible kind of powers that exist. There's a lot of power dynamics at play here, and I think what I've tried to do is try and give the stage to students as much as possible. And so for me, I'm a facilitator, I'm a supporter of kind of giving the stage to students so that they can do, like Anjali said, they know the answer, they know what the issues are, they know how to resolve some of these issues as well. All they need is the resources and support. So I think we need to bring them in as co-learners, as co-creators, as co-designers of these solutions. And I think at UBC, I mean, you would know that student activism has had a huge impact. We have declared climate emergency in 2019 because of the students, because of student activism. And I think that UBC is trying to move that beyond towards that framework as well. We have just launched students as co-designers of curriculum at our Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. So we are moving towards that more and more. And we are realizing the impact and power of students and kind of bringing them on board and creating that teaching and learning aspect of things too, not just in the co-curricular setting, but also in the curricular setting. So I'm hoping that we can do more and more of that. And that's how I do it. So I would, and it has worked, hopefully. So I'll continue doing that.
I love that focus on co-creation. I think that's really an incredible step in the right direction. But I just want to go back to a phrase that you used, systemic invisible powers in universities. So if we think about transformational change, we can think about, teaching around the SDGs and promoting active engagement and critical reflection. We can encourage community engagement and global citizenship. But surely if universities are engaging with the transformational agenda of the SDGs, there will be some reflection on those invisible powers, on power dynamics within universities and decision-making platforms within universities. Louise, is this something that you've engaged with in some of the localization work you've done?
I started my teaching position recently at your university. So I'd say my personal experience that I don't have a good grasp of that power dynamics, but it's obviously something that is, well known by everybody. There is an interesting way to look at this. There's a book called Sustainable Development Goals in Higher Education, and they do identify like 4 archetypes of how universities are engaging, and they're basically like 2 axes. It's how deep the commitment is of the university, and deep you can think about as wide also. So commitment in terms of the student body, in terms of the faculty members, in terms of the administration of the university, and also the commitment in terms of innovation and how the universities are addressing the integration of the SDGs. Are we just using the usual processes and doing business as usual, or are we going and trying to do something different and being more bold and more open and more critical about not only what others are doing in the university, but what the work that we do ourselves. So between those 2 axes, you can the ideal engagement with the transformational one, where we have a deep commitment and a wide commitment to the SDGs, but also the approach is very bold, is very innovative in the sense that we're not just teaching as we always taught, and we're not just reproducing the internal processes in our university as we see in society at large that recreate those social inequalities or that unbalance of wealth and power within the institutions.
Thank you, Louise. We've got a question from the audience. Can you just repeat the name of that book that you referred to?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just put in the chat. It's the Sustainable Development Goals in Higher Education, a Transformative Agenda, ? So it was published last year when Steely and Lauren Rickards. And I highly recommend the book.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks.
Shanta was faster than me.
Shanta is very fast. Anjali, I'm waiting for a very fervent response here with lots of hand gestures. To what extent are you trying to shift balance of power in these discussions around the SDGs at your university?
I think you've gotten to the heart of what we're trying to do, both through my work as a student at the University of British Columbia, but also with Reimagine 17, which is essentially just a community of practice that formed of different young people across what is currently Canada coming together on our experiences, is we are trying to use what is transformative about the SDGs while making sure we are mindful of the ways that the SDGs continue to support and buttress dominant, colonial, oppressive approaches to sustainability and development. So what does that mean? That means using where the SDGs have transformative power. We talked about how they can interconnect issues and help reveal that the silos that universities like to operate in, where wellness, sustainability, food security, like poverty, racism exist in different spaces, bring those together and push institutions to do that. push institutions to remember that development isn't isolated to people over there, primarily Black, Brown, and Indigenous people over there, but it is something that where the global north, where educational institutions, including educational institutions like UBC, who think they are progressive, also have so much room for improvement as a tool to encourage collaboration, and in that way try to subvert existing power dynamics while appreciating and understanding that we need to also move beyond the SDGs and be explicit in naming where they fall short, where they lack more radical transformational understandings of sustainability. So they're just one tool we use in shifting power.
That is an excellent point. We've actually got a really interesting question that's come through in the chat box now, and it looks at the engagement of universities and academic institutions with governance, federal as well as provincial government. So the question is, Canada is a federated state where kindergarten to grade 12 education is a provincial territorial jurisdiction. However, federal departments lead the implementation of SDGs. In that light, what is the role for the federal government in something like education? For example, the interprovincial body that brings together provincial education ministers has no federal counterpart. Before documenting or funding, does the federal government have a leadership role to play, or just get out of the way and let others lead, or is there an in-between? What role does the government have?
That sounds like a political science question.
There we go, Rose. Fantastic.
So the federal government, they're the interlocutor between the globe and the local, I guess. And so being in that space means that they have a lot of scope for defining the problems and focusing attention on the particular problems. The other thing the federal government can do is they do have a spending power, right? And past governments have had no qualms about spending in the area of education, like for example, the Millennium Scholarship, right? So they can do a lot in terms of, you know, directing and shaping the big picture. I would also say that we haven't talked that much about research, but it was mentioned during this past week, at least in one session, the importance of research here, that the federal government is the primary source of support for research. So when it comes to research, I think there is a gap. I do believe there is a gap in research right now around the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm seeing through my other networks that there's a lot of activity around that in Europe. There's a lot of interest in the SDGs, and are they working? Are they standing for what they say? Are governments taking them on board? Are they practical? Are they transformative? All of these same questions. Are they inclusive? Do they need more different people at the table and different voices? All of these questions are being asked by researchers in other parts of the world and also in the global South. They're asking these same questions, and yet the support and funding for research around these, I think, could be a lot stronger. And that is definitely something that the federal government has a role in, much more than the provinces.
Thank you, Rose. That's a very important point. We have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to each give you 30 seconds to share some advice for academics and students wanting to engage with the SDGs in their universities. I'm going to start with Shanta.
My advice or my suggestion would be to start with yourself. And that's what I do in my teaching with the teacher education program here at UBC, is that you have to, and with the Sustainability Ambassadors program as well, that you have to start with yourself. You have to start with clarifying your own value systems and how do they connect to the systemic value systems or social values. And once you have done that and you have connected your values with what you want to do in the sustainability and climate realm, and how do they connect to the SDGs and the global framework, then everything should usually falls in place. I think the hardest part is convincing yourself at the personal level, and then attaching that to what you want to do externally. So I would say start with yourself first.
Thank you, Shanta. Louise? 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll break into your question actually. And I think I kind of answered those already, because if you're more in the idea level, more abstract level, I would highly recommend to read that book that I mentioned. I think you can start there to get a sense of the big ideas. And then if you're an action-oriented person, really start where you are. As I said, it needs to be a deep commitment of the whole community. It needs to be an all of university approach. But different universities show that they can start in different places. So if you're a faculty member, if you're a student, we have Anjali here. If you are in the administration, there's always something that you can do. And SDSN Canada, actually, our host, is a great place to start and look for those ideas and examples. So it's similar to Shanta's example. Is start where you are, whatever position you have in the university. There's a place to get started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Louise. Roz, I'm going to cut you down to 15 seconds.
I would just say what I always tell my students, it helps to have a deadline. And the window for action on the SDGs is closing rapidly. So we can't afford business as usual.
Thank you. And Anjali, one last powerful closing sentiment.
Awesome. Okay. If you are a student, tapping into your power and connecting with other young people who are mobilizing, Reimagine 17 is one network that you could tap into, but there are also lots of others. And if you are part of an academic institution, or if you are an educator, know that youth action is happening, and your role is to support and enable.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our wonderful and very inspiring speakers. And if you have any questions or you'd like to have access to resources, my colleague has inserted some of our email addresses in the chat, so reach out to us. We have collected an entire folder of resources related to the SDGs in academia from around the world, so don't hesitate to reach out to us. And best of luck the next session, and thanks very much. Have a lovely afternoon.